it's getting charged, but again, goes back to that transparency piece of us advocating for the fact that a big cleaning fees can't get put on us in March when orientation happened in September. So I think advocating and fighting that is important. But again, yeah, it's within that invoicing that happens in the fall, if that makes sense.
Thank you for the clarification.
No worries.
Thank you very much. Are there any further last speakers for or against this motion? Seeing none, I will call the question. All those in favor, please raise your placards. Those opposed? Any abstentions? Motion 6 is carried. This now marks the end of so this already occurred. I first invite Chairperson George to provide a board update from the consultation period.
Thank you. So yeah, this is just the assembly, as was discussed at our previous assembly there. The layout of the document largely tries to go about it in the formatting where it shows the executive policy themes and suggestions, which was Appendix CO2 from the consultation period, and then as well the submissions that were more specific to the policy bylaws changes that we just approved at the previous board meeting, which I did mention I'll provide more detail on. They're broken down by 2 submissions, as we did receive only 2 different submissions, so each submission details what their concerns were and what specific amendments they suggested, if any. And then as well, towards the end of the document, we have the board outcomes and rationale. I'm going to start off with submission 2, as that one's a bit quicker of an overview in the rationale for why it was not incorporated to the policy. So within submission 2, it was more so around the procedure for the credit cards piece, and specifically the credit card policy, and less so around the capacity for the board to initiate executive discipline or administrative leaves and complaints committee process. While that is definitely important as well to the board has a different document for that. So we have, as mentioned, the assembly there's the finance policy manual that's coming forward for April approval, and that will have the policy that allocates what document to refer to for the procedural practice of credit cards. Their concerns are largely resolved within what our procedural document is for credit cards. So what I was able to do to get agreement from governance committee was that following the approval of the finance policy manual at the April board meeting, it will then, that finance policy manual, just like our governance policy manual, will be made available online in our corporate policy section. Further, I'll also take the credit card procedure document to President's Council, as that will be the next meeting that will occur after that approval for them to be able to see the credit card procedural document in specific, just because we don't post procedural documents on our website. So that was why submission 2 didn't show any active amendments in response to it, just largely because it was out of the scope of specifically the executive discipline policy. Back to submission 1, I do want to give time to this. So this was submitted by an assembly member as well, and this was largely around integrating FACSOCs into the initiation, assessment, and reporting process for the committee, the exec complaints committee. So submission 1 had largely in amending 4.61B was adding that a FACSOC president can initiate a complaint for an executive with this process. Additionally, 4.6.1C was that to add that a FACSOC representative, or president, sorry, was representative on the committee that does this process once established. And then as well to add a transparency clause, which was provided in the submission for 4.7. And then 4.8 was an administrative leave authority section, was adding also another transparency provision. And then section 4.9 was submitting a final disciplinary authority, which was to add that the executive committee provide a summary briefing to FACSOC presidents prior to assembly considerations subject to confidentiality requirements. So that's what the submission was to the executive policy piece, not the bylaw. So I'm just going to go forward to what the board outcomes from that were. So as previously mentioned, 4.61B, the board found that amendable and has incorporated language as per legal feedback to better represent what the concerns of the submission were. So that was integrating the wording of member of a corporation. A member of the corporation may initiate a complaint. In this process, there's also been additional wording around ensuring that a bulking of complaints is possible to be done in case of a shorter period of time. There's several complaints that we don't want each complaint having to rule separately and then rely on a separate complaint to be concluded for appropriate disciplinary action to be initiated if all the complaints are around the same substance or concern. So that has been added in as well. For 4.61C, we were amendable to that, and that was incorporated through the BOD governance policy manual. And that's where the committee determines that a member of the corporation per bylaw 5.11 and the Constitution section 3.2.5 part 2 shall also be on the executive complaints committee. So this is especially regarding addressing the concerns of if it were a complaint around a FACSOC matter that is not technically a society affair. With this, I do want to provide clarity as before I go into the remaining of the document on the outcomes, is the members of the corporation wording was quite specific from our legal team, as they mentioned that we can't be providing preferential shareholder treatment, which is essentially where if we were to list out a specific only faculty society presidents or only a certain FACSOC representative, then that is technically preferential treatment under ONCA, so we have to be making sure to just list out members of the corporation. So that opens it up to all assembly voting members. For participating on this and initiating a complaint, but additionally, obviously, as from the board's perspective, the executive, that committee for the executive disciplinary assessment will be able to kind of have the appropriate roles in place on that composition to make the calls around whether or not there needs to be additional parties integrated within the committee, but also if sorry, I'm losing my train of thought here. Oh yeah, but also if to make sure that the member of the corporation wording isn't being abused. So of course we would prefer that if it was something in relation to a FACSOC operational concern, then another FACSOC pres would likely be on that committee. Within that regard, it is an observer non-voting member. That was just also advised by our legal team as to make sure that the quorum and the ability for an adjudication of a committee for an extreme matter can be done appropriately, and while also bringing to a conclusion of any disciplinary actions that need to be issued. So going to section 4.7's amendment submission, this was the one that was not amendable from this submission. This is only because it's now made unnecessary with the previous amendable portion, as clarified by legal, with the further parameter of a notice requirements to members of the assembly. Second to last is section 4.8. We were amendable and incorporated through the current governance policy manual. And this is around the notice of administrative leave that should be delivered to members of the corporation, aka members of the AMS assembly. And lastly, but not least, is we were amendable to and incorporated through the governance policy manual the submission around section 4.9. And this was around the disciplinary action transparency provisions. So we would forward such a recommendation of any type of disciplinary action to the AMS Assembly together with a summary briefing setting out the nature of the complaint, including any relevant policies or bylaws that the exec director and officer has been found to have breached, and the reason for the committee's recommendation. In such instances, the identity of any complaint shall not be disclosed to the AMS Assembly without the complainant's express consent. So these changes have been reconciled into the documents and will be moving forward. I do also want to clarify, and the assembly member was comfortable with me saying this, is I did meet with the assembly member and got their confidence in the current amendments proposed from what their submission was for submission number 1. With that, there is only one other part to submission 1, which is the bylaw portion. So with the bylaw portion, I do want to clarify is, again, that was largely just around a misconception around what goes into bylaws versus policy and procedure. So the submission, while it isn't incorporated in the bylaw, it's not necessarily because we didn't want to, but it's just not necessary to. It's actually meant for the policy to overview. So that's been incorporated in the policy as per their policy submission of amendments. But I will leave it there for any questions.
Are there any questions for this discussion topic?
Clare Nolly Nursing Science Society. Are you doing submission 2 after submission 1? Are you going to talk about it or no? I probably missed it. My only question then, because I read through the doc, can you bring the Board of Directors Finance Policy Manual to President's Council too? Cool. Because you're bringing, it says, like the new credit card procedure. Can you? Because you said it's going to get approved by the board. I was just wondering if there could be like consultation prior or no, just to look at it and to like any faculty society input or no.
I would say for the finance policy, that one gets a little tricky, specifically because the finances jurisdiction is quite quite direct to the board's authority versus executive discipline. But I do agree is that like I can bring the finance policy to be available to be shared at President's Caucus when we share the procedure. And as I said, like that policy manual will be up available on the website publicly where we've put all our policies once it's approved. With that, I think and it can be shared, and of course, just like any policy that's currently on the corporate policies page, if you have like a concern around it or like, hey, this doesn't seem right, or I have a question around this or a possible suggestion or concern, please like email the board chair or vice chair or the respective committee chair that's listed in the policy document. If there's like a responsible chair, i.e. if you had like a concern on investment policy, you would email the investment committee chair, because that's super helpful in inputting like how we change our policies. With the finance policy though, is I would restrain from the board having to further hold off approving some necessary financial parameters around other policies we have within the manual, because it is quite all-encompassing around finances for the corporation. So that's where I would get a little worrisome, but it's any policies open for feedback or suggestions. It's just we will still have to go forward with an April approval for that finance policy, if that answers your question. Perfect. Yes.
Are there any further questions for the discussion topic? All right. Our agenda is now complete. Thank you everyone for coming. May I have a mover and a seconder for the motion to adjourn? Amazing. Meeting is adjourned as 8:13 p.m.